Kinesiology 223, Chapter 11, still talking leadership. And within presentation number 8, we're talking about conflict and confrontation. And I got to tell you, as a coach, it's going to be part of the deal, whether it's you and your other coaches, you and your athletes, you and your administration, you and the opposing coach, but you're going to have some conflict and you're going to have some confrontation. There's no doubt. It's just part of the deal, but you have to be able to process it in a way that's positive, right? And just get myself out of the way now. So there's a bit of a rift that happens, and I've talked about it a couple times. When you're talking about conflict and confrontation between the coach and the athlete, you have a expected versus actual outcome and expected versus actual behavior. And many times that conflict and confrontation comes as a result of that separation. Again, if you have the expectation and actual outcome are spot on, or outcome exceeds value over average, the expected, you're golden. But as a coach, you have to be able to offer dialogue and input and coaching cues to be able to get the desired response. And sometimes, that will come with a little bit of conflict and confrontation. But if you do it correctly, you can mitigate that and really have it be a positive coaching environment instead of a negative coaching environment. And the other component they make, or the point they make here, is that when you look at communication, it's inherently difficult, and the different communication styles can also cause conflict. And again, you have this expected communication style, and here's the actual result and what's being, how things are being communicated. That difference between those two, that can cause conflict. So, as a coach, you have to be omni-aware of the people you're coaching, be very aware of their styles and personality traits. And, if you're a college coach, you're recruiting these people in anyways, so that'll be in the wash. They'll know you as a coach anyways. But, as somebody who might be taking over a program, you have to take time to learn your people and learn what makes them tick. So you quite literally, as a coach, have to offer critique. You have to offer cues. And depending upon you as a coach, your personality, or depending upon the athlete, their personality, it can come off as confrontational, right? They're expecting conversation, it's becoming confrontational. They wanted a little bit of insight, it becomes a critique on what they're doing. But again, it's part of the deal. You have to critique and cue your athletes, but you have to do it from a place of benevolence to help them be a better athlete, as opposed to beating them down into the ground. So there's types of conflict that have to, if you will, be managed, and we'll see in a second. But one of the biggies that they talk about is, down here, they have several of them: unmet expectations, disagreements, underperformance, private life issues. There are definitely areas of conflict between athletes and coaches, and sometimes some of the personal stuff, like we talked about, spills over into the practice environment. Now, if you all offer an open and welcoming and engaging environment, and your athlete has a problem, and they can come to you and say, "Hey, coach, I'm dragging, one of our roommates had to go back home, and as a result, I had to pick up a part-time job. I'm at UPS unloading trucks at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm wiped out by practice time." That helps resolve that conflict, but that conversation doesn't happen unless you enable it as a coach. So let's move on. It starts with a process, and it starts with the mindset, and it starts with developing the right culture. And, it provides the environment, like I mentioned, to allow things to happen. Now, the book goes into team building early in the season, addressing conflicts early, engaging mediators in the resolution of conflict, and having structured as opposed to unstructured meetings. And we talked about that in the last presentation, and I'm on board with that. And I think there's a place for, within talking X's and O's on a screen with your team, or talking about big picture goals and things that are going on in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, I think there's a place for a coach to be able to carve out a little bit of time to be able to have these kind of conversations regarding team culture and things that need to be talked about as a team or a group before it blossoms and becomes just a massive, massive hindrance to the process and a small issue becomes a big, big issue that can't be overcome. They're making the point down here that that athletes need to be taught these skills, these conflict resolution skills. Oops, sorry about that. Conflict resolution skills, and it is critical to the effectiveness of teams. I mean, part of conflict resolution is problem solving, and it's part of a much bigger picture, sure. But when you have a team full of individuals who all have different personalities, and there may be conflict within and amongst members on a team, you have to be able to have that conversation with a teammate or with your coach, and maybe the coach ends up being the mediator on this, and it's not somebody who's a third party outside of the team. It actually is the coach who helps to try to mediate the process. And this is a truism, right? of like life and in sport. You just want to avoid confrontation when you're angry. You can say the wrong thing. It becomes a more emotional as opposed to a logical type of argument. And the heat of the moment can really escalate a conflict and turn it from something that could be a process where you're trying to resolve an issue to where it becomes an attack on the other person's character, and it's not what you want, right? And the saying goes, sometimes you need to go to the balcony. And by that, what's inferred is you're in an argument with somebody, and instead of letting it escalate, you become the bigger person. You say, give me a moment, and you take a moment, you literally go out to the balcony, you get some fresh air, you cool down, you get a drink of water, you come back and you sit down and you talk things through logically, as opposed to letting something escalate to a point where it's not resolvable anymore. So there's many times where they list here like athletes and coaches or students and teachers, have a confrontation. And what you have is you have this bit of like a power difference between those. Ultimately, the coach can do whatever they want. Ultimately, the teacher can pretty much do whatever they want. And there are ways to mitigate that, and you have ways to resolve grievances that are built into education as well as, coaches and athletes. But, a coach has to be humble enough and have their ego in check enough to be able to have a conversation with an athlete who might very well be irritated, frustrated, and perturbed with the coach. And the coach has to be able to navigate that conversation. And though it is one of the more personal things, I mean, it's a lot like raising an adolescent, it doesn't become more personal than I hate you and you're doing this and you're doing that. But as a coach, you have to then work with that athlete and say, okay, I understand you're frustrated and upset and et cetera. Let's talk it through as to why. And let me give you my perspective as to why I'm doing what I'm doing. And maybe somewhere in there we can figure out why you feel this way and I believe this way. And maybe I'm just not seeing something in your ability that you believe you have. And let's try to resolve this. I mean, as a coach, sometimes you got to put your ego in check. Otherwise, it becomes a situation where you're a dictator. I like these both. I like these both from 264, I believe it is, to 265, and they talk about how you have this model for understanding interpersonal conflict in sport, and then you have this individual communication styles and managing conflict as well. I like when they talk about this compelling, collaborating, comprising, and accommodating, and so I think in some regards you probably want to spend some time and read through those. And you might kind of wrap yourself around some of these traits within the model itself and think, oh yeah, I remember a coaching time or time in athletics where I confronted a coach, or I was in a situation, or I've constantly said this through my presentations, think back to times where you've had some of these exchanges with people who may have been in a role of power, and you've had to kind of process some things, or maybe just sit and wonder why your coach is doing a certain behavior, and maybe some of these will help you understand it a little bit more. When they start talking about interpersonal conflict, and what I like about this is you start looking at the interpersonal factors, right? Things like ego versus task, self-esteem, interpersonal factors that might happen, the external factors that may happen, and then they go into the nature of the conflict itself, like what is the actual issue at hand? And I said it before, sometimes conflict is well, it's certainly rarely the cause, right? The conflict itself is a behavioral component that is the end result of another cause. It's the result, basically. And so now you have to kind of untie that ball of yarn to figure out where the conflict came from. And, you kind of wrap yourself around it and embrace this as a process. You start going, okay, this athlete is in front of me and they're frustrated and irritated and they're expressing their concerns. There's a reason for that, and there's an entire series of events that led up to that athlete coming to you and saying, Coach, I need to talk. And you have to honor that as a coach, and you have to be respectful of that, because that athlete had to overcome probably a pretty sizable psychological and emotional barrier to be able to come up to you and say that. Now, when you have a confrontation, you got to understand that like all the needs are legitimate and important and they got to be attended to. But sometimes you have to rank order these or maybe prioritize like what is going to be the most critical for solving the issue. And sometimes an athlete may request certain things and there's just not enough resources or not enough time, or perhaps as a result of them not being skilled enough to be on the first team, they just don't have the time and you don't have the practice schedule available, practice time available to coach that athlete. So I like this, in terms of the statement here that, in every individual lies untapped power and capacity, and people in conflict, they know what they want and they know what they need. But I will tell you this, there's sometimes where you might have an athlete in conflict and they feel what they need, they can sense it, it's like visceral, but they can't articulate it, right? And so sometimes as a coach, you have to tease this out and get out of your athletes what that frustration is, especially with younger kids. They just might storm around, stomp their feet, and really be ticked off. And, you as a coach, you have to be like, all right, I see this going on. Jennifer, what's going on? I mean, you're stomping around the basketball court. Can you tell me what's going on? And, they may have difficulty articulating what's going on, but emotionally and at a visceral level, they feel it, right? And you have to kind of work with them through that process. And it really is a case where the process is as important as the content, because you're talking about, providing the opportunity for that athlete to have a voice, to be able to have a conversation with you about what's wrong with them, be able to move on. And they really talk about this as a flow of feelings, thoughts, and events. And, you, as a listener, you got to be able to process that and just sometimes maybe nod your head, and then at certain times be able to offer poignant bullet points. The next three, I think, also have their place. Improving situations is different than solving problems. You just might be in a exchange with an athlete where, what they're asking you to do is a matter of allowing them to be like the starting point guard of a team. But, you're talking about how you can maybe improve their situation, help them become a better athlete. They may not become a starting point guard. Maybe they become the second team point guard, or they become the first team other guard, right? It's pretty straightforward to try to find a solution. But, you have to be pretty honest with your athletes, and you have to give them the expectation that you need to perform to be able to move up. So I can't really solve all your problems, so we can improve your situation. Everybody is right to a certain degree, but to some degree as a coach, you may have to lay down the law and tell them where they're wrong. Even though they're absolutely convinced that they're in the right, you may have to be the one to tell them where they're in the wrong, and then maybe reaffirm some areas where they are, in fact, in the right. And boy, you'll have athletes that'll stomp their feet and just really defend their point of view, and you may have to just kind of sit back and nod your head and then finally say, no. Solutions and resolutions are temporary states of balance and are not absolute or timeless. I love this because it denotes an evolving process, and one as a coach that you're involved in organically, and also one that you kind of can control and have some guidance and some stewardship. Do's and don'ts when initiating confrontation. Love it. Take a moment on 266 and 267. Take a look at that. You're not going to be arguing. You're not going to stop communicating. You want to be able to focus on the task at hand. So guys, we got one more presentation. I'm going to sign off of this one and move on to the next.